So I'm very much aware that this is the only talk on the program that has nothing to do with the metaphysics or physics of time. But I thought it might be interesting, and also it doesn't really have to, it's not a topic that's well known in philosophy so much. And so I have a kind of heavy burden in terms of background setup. And so I'm gonna spend some time setting up, and then when I was trying to think about what to do, what I didn't want it to just be a bunch of assertions of things, and so I do want to have one argument. So I've been working on temporal discounting for a while now, and I thought it would be interesting for this conference to see where tense versus tenseless comes up in an area in social science. No one in social science talks about this distinction or knows this distinction at all. But since I was working on this stuff, and I was reading all of this stuff for the last few years, but by day being a philosopher of time, I was then, all the while I was thinking, that there's something going on with tense versus tenseless, and finally, in a kind of back and forth with emails with Katie Steele, all of a sudden it was like, boom! I just saw like the debate reshaped in a different way. And so a lot of these observations are kind of trivial, but they'd still be new. And then there's one kind of argument which I think is kind of interesting. Temporal discounting, all your decisions are decisions weighing different goods or harms at different times, and you're weighing them back and forth. Should you have the cookie today? Well, it has some benefits, but then it has some costs, and you try to think things through. Oh shit. Oh, did you? Oh, but that wasn't, ooh. That's like some kind of human causation, right? So there's been, so if you haven't, looked at this literature, there's literally thousands of studies in social science, so behavioral economics, psychology, social psychology, business studies and whatnot, where the environment, where people look at discounting. And so there's all these different topics that are common. I actually have the motivation for all of this actually has some political and social motivation. None of that will appear here, but if you're interested, you can ask me. And what I'm going to do today is just show how keeping an eye on tense will actually sort of lead to several novel observations about this literature and debates there. No, it works. Okay. So I'm going to talk about future discounting. So some philosophers like Parfit talk about past discounting, and there's a bit of a literature there in philosophy. But future discounting is the fact that the people have talked about it since Socrates, but that the amount you tend to care about a good as it goes up out in time tends to decrease, and so people do this discounting, and so you tend to care about goods that are temporally distant less. That's not always the case. There's actually temporal inflators, not discounters. And in social science and economics, what you're using is usually just expected utility theory. So I'm trying to figure out, I'm doing some kind of cost-benefit analysis. This is done everywhere. So this is, if you build a bridge in almost any country, there'll be some cost-benefit analysis. And you weigh the probabilities and the utilities through time. And then what will happen is you'll use a discount function. And so that's that thing D. And the discount function will discount the value out through time of the goods. And then you can choose different, and so it's interesting in itself because in social science, then what people are doing is they're yanking out your time preference from your other preferences. So they're not thinking, so you could think, I have a certain preference for a vanilla cake over a chocolate cake. Maybe I could also do things in terms of a today cake versus a tomorrow cake. So we don't whip out a flavor function over cake. and then think that you just have that go around with this kind of stable flavor function. But they do think that with time, which I think is actually an error. And then they worry about the form of that function. And so you can have different forms, but in economics, what is viewed as normatively rational is an exponential form. And so they don't care about like the actual value so much. They care about the form. And so here, I'll explain this more. You don't even have to worry about the math really for what I've got coming, but T is going to be the time sort of, time, the timeline. Tau is it's going to end up being like the now, but it's the evaluation point. And so the discount function D is then looking at the delay from the evaluation point. So if I have to wait a long time, then how much do I discount those things? And so you'll see that with the exponential time discounting, be some function that's always written like this, where rho is then the discount rate, and t minus tau is then this kind of exponential. Often you won't see the tau for reasons that will become clear. And then there's this kind of issue that comes up, and this is like grossly simplifying a huge literature, where the economists are thinking we should discount exponentially. But in psychology, where you're looking at descriptive stuff, the people, the folk, discount hyperbolically. And that doesn't mean hyperbolically like a lot. It means hyperbolically like the hyperbolic function, where you'll notice that they don't discount, the people don't discount enough for the economists as you go out in time. So they have diminishing, they talk about the problem of diminishing impatience. And so anyway, in the kind of typical experiment, I've stolen all the pictures from Lakshmi Mani, who has these great pictures. But here's the typical experimental paradigm. So you ask, the subject come in. They come in only to the lab or to the Turk, study the one time, which will be crucial. And you ask them, Lakshmi, do you want $100 today or $120 in a week? And we're in the kind of preferences era of economics, so there's no wrong answer. You just answer, and then you look at inconsistencies with your other answers, right? So they're not judging your particular answer. So you can say whatever you want. Lakshmi says, I'll take $100 today. But then you can ask her also, Lakshmi, do you want $100 in a year or $120 in a year and a week? And then, she might say, I'll take $120, duh. And so this is a kind of typical reaction that people have. And so you can think of the paradigm as a kind of smaller sooner versus larger later. So you've got the smaller sooner reward versus the larger later reward. And you can just play with these two parameters, increasing or decreasing the reward and increasing the delay. And then you can find a point where you're indifferent between the two. And that will then give you a way to estimate a person's discount function. And so, but this is viewed as a problem by some, so here in the kind of notation that's used in economics and rational choice theory, Lakshmi is preferring $100 now to $120 in a week, but then she's, then her preference flips the other way, where she prefers the $100 to the $120 to the 100. She's willing to wait that extra week if she's already waited 52 weeks. Now, that can't be accommodated with the exponential discount function. So the exponential discount function is special because it's the one form that takes the same proportion of utility off in every time period. And so to an exponential discounter, a week is a week, 20 bucks is 20 bucks. Doesn't matter what the rest, And so you should not look at those other things. 20 bucks a week. It should be the answer should be the same. With a hyperbolic discounter, on the other hand, you can see if you start over there on the left, you might prefer the larger reward, but as you move closer to the rewards, then you can see there's that inflection where you switch. And that is then viewed as, well, that's what the folk do, but then this is viewed as then the problem. What do the experts think about all this? Here they are, all three of them. There's the economist on the left. The economist says, and this is again grossly overgeneralizing, discounting is rational so long as it's exponential. And we'll see why. In philosophy, there's a long tradition all the way from Socrates saying, don't discount, just don't do it. It's bad. And then in psychology, what they do is they say, well, we're just doing, psychology, we're doing descriptive stuff. And so they say, well, the folk actually discount hyperbolically, and then they try to find different hyperbolic functions to fit the data. Generally, they've failed to come up with any kind of hyperbolic thing that fits all the different sorts of experiments. And there's this, but there is this kind of implicit judging going on, because they say, we don't judge, but it's associated with, obesity, stupidity, poverty, and so then it's considered bad. Why is it considered rational in economics? So Paul Samuelson, the father of modern economics, he came up with discounted utility theory and an exponential form of discounted utility theory. And he said at the end of his paper, any connection between utility as discussed here and any welfare concept is disavowed. The idea that such a mathematical investigation could have any influence upon ethical judgments of policy is one which deserves the impatience of modern economists. It said all similar things. Couldn't have been clearer. There's completely non-normative, the choice of the exponential discount function. So he picks it just for simplicity. It's simple. How did it transform from the 30s to, Ramsey said the same thing, more or less. He thought that discounting, he also came up independently with the exponential discount function, but also didn't like it ethically. Well, what happened? Well, Stroetz, an economist at Northwestern in the 50s, proves this kind of dominance result, where this then gave the exponential discounting this kind of normative glow. And so the idea was that the exponential discounter exponential discounting will dominate over any non-exponential discounting. And so if you discount some other way, you can be exploited. And so this is, if you think of things, the philosophers are familiar, of course, with like Dutch book theorems and things like that. And so if you think being susceptible to a Dutch book makes you irrational, some philosophers think that that does, some that thinks that it doesn't. This is a similar sort of thing here, but now with preferences. And the idea is you've got a kind of preference set up if you're a hyperbolic discounter, such that you are now susceptible to exploitation.
Quick clarification, so not discounting at all is in some trivial limit cases exponential.
Yes. Yeah. Either zero is, yeah. So not, yeah. So in that sense, philosophers and economists are on the same page. Anyway, I don't have time to talk about this, but there's a kind of familiar sort of picture that philosophers, I think, will be familiar with when you think of other, you've got this sort of normative theory, probability theory, logic, and then you have these sort of departures from it, and are they then rational or not? And there's this kind of story of system one, system two. Most of that, I think, is widely accepted, but I also think is bullshit. But anyway, tense versus tenseless. What if we look at the whole debate from the point of view of tense and tenselessness? So that's what I started to do. Again, my main goal is this kind of more social political, but it was kind of interesting. So here I'll just mention three quick observations without defense, and then get into my argument because I don't have that much time. And so the first thing is that it's kind of interesting that, so all of discounting is tensed, right? It's always the delay from now. That's always tensed. But then if you look at Stroetz's result, the tau drops out. It's just gone. And you can, of course, see this when you just look at what the exponential function is, because you're taking off the same proportion of utility throughout. then it doesn't really matter where you are. So that little yellow, that little orange dot that I was imagining as the now, you can just put yourself anywhere. So if I discount 25% off per day, you know, I can just move the now around and I discount 25% off per day. It doesn't matter where I am. And so it's kind of interesting that this drops out in the, so it's interesting that in economics then, the main result about the normativity of discounting is a function that where tense disappears. But it's there, but it doesn't matter, you know. Another thing that's interesting is that hyperbolic discounting is tensed. So there's a kind of common hyperbolic form where alpha and beta are just constants that you try to use to fit the data. And of course, you know, if you think of that picture where you have that transition in the hyperbolic discounting, then it's crucial that I have the orange dot moving along. And so to be able to model that switch where I come up along upon my rewards and then I switch, you know, first I wanted larger, then I wanted smaller. Well, now I need, you know, the evaluation point in the now back in there. And so I can't do that without adding tense back in. And so crucially, to model all this allegedly inconsistent behavior, then I have to reintroduce tense. And so what we've got then is a kind of picture where the normative picture from economics is tenseless discounting, but then the folk are doing tense discounting. But it's sometimes said that there can be time-consistent hyperbolic discounting. So, well, now in the UK, when you do climate discounting, you can do, that's not, the government now allows to do non-exponential discounting, where you discount different amounts per time. And then there are other versions, and so, you know, to the right down at the bottom, that's the climate economist Weitzman's discount function. It's almost social, not individual, but you'll see it's not exponential, but there's no tau, and it's consistent. And so you can then see that time consistent hyperbolic discounting can happen, and it can be consistent even though it's hyperbolic, which in this field seems like a contradiction, but it's not, because, and what's happened is that you've just chosen a non-exponential function without tau dependence. So a quick intuitive way to see this is just that if I decide to discount, you know, everything, say 4% from 2030 to 2040, and then everything 5% from 2040 to 2050, as long as I calculate all that into my utilities, then I can't be exploited. It's only that kind of switching thing that allows the threat of exploitation. So the three observations, I've already kind of talked about that. How much time do I have? 15 minutes? Oh, good. Okay, so now, so I can talk more about those, and if you, you know, in Q&A. Now, there's this kind of problem with the Stroats result. So what I want to do is I want to sort of, what I tried to do is come up with the best defense I could of the Stroats result, and then destroy it, because I hate it. But anyway, it's kind of interesting thinking about it from the point of view of tense. So there's this weird thing that I noticed when I was looking at the Stroats thing, because so exponential discounted utility theory is provably is implied by normal exponential discount. Sorry, too many E's. Normal expected utility theory plus an axiom called stationarity. So you do exponential expected utility theory. So let's just sort of, there's lots of philosophical objections to it, but let's just sort of bracket those, because they're not going to be special to, those objections are going to be objections to this whole thing, you know, whole picture rather than just the discounting aspect. And so, I mean, so Koopmans shows that expected utility theory plus this axiom of stationarity implies exponential discounting. But then there's this kind of weird thing when I was looking at stationarity. Well, first of all, you think, why is it irrational to be non-stationary? It's not so obvious, so in expected utility theory, you've got all these axioms like transitivity and things like that, at least on their surface, they seem like, that's pretty good, a rational person should do that. Here, though, with stationarity, it's not so obvious. The sort of normative import of stationarity seems kind of arbitrary. And then people keep saying that you have this preference reversal, but they have to, then I noticed it when I saw they kept talking about static reversals. I thought, what the hell is a static reversal? And then the paradigm is these people just come into the lab or they're answering the question just one time, at one time instance. And so at that one time, you prefer, say, smaller sooner and larger later. Why are you irrational? And so you don't really get this inconsistency. So, in the way you would write stationarity, so that it would then be a kind of indifference between these two. And so Lakshmi there is supposed to be indifferent between these two. But why do I have to be indifferent between those two? And as soon as you start thinking about it, you can come up with like 100 different explanations for why you might not be. So what you really want, or what they really want, is so does rationality demand this? Okay. So anyway, holding it hardly seems a dictate of reason. I mean, there are different ways you can see it, but basically, if you have like any kind of desire for a kind of temporal pattern in your preferences, then that would be a violation of stationarity, but it's not clear why it's irrational. So it seems normatively unmoored. So what you really want, instead of, so what they're really talking about when they talk about preference reversal is this, right? So I've got my judgment on the top, maybe I prefer smaller, maybe I prefer S. I don't know why I didn't do S and L for smaller, larger. That would have made a lot of sense, but then to go back and change all the slides. So now we're at S and R. So maybe I choose S, and then later and then I have to keep choosing S as the now moves up to it. And so that's then consistency. So you can see how it compares with stationarity. Stationarity is from the one evaluation time. When I write it, notice there's this tau there. So at that evaluation time, that's then when I might be indifferent between the two. Now, when I go to consistency, now notice I've got a tau prime. So that's the orange dot moved up. And so this you could sort of see, there's no deviation from a plan. I had a plan, I want S over R. Now I come upon it, I still want S over R. That's what consistency is saying. Now, how can you get from stationarity to consistency or consistency to stationarity? Well, then there's this nice, kind of bridge principle. I'm sorry to hit you with some. It's better with the pictures than just like the things. So if you hate me for all of these things going around, at least I've given you the pictures. So here invariance then says, if I take everything, the now and the rewards, and just shift them all, then if I'm indifferent between those two, then it turns out that of those three conditions, invariance, consistency, and stationarity, any two implies the third. And in fact, you can do if you assume transitivity, you can do a proof by picture. So if you're indifference between the top two, then you're stationary. If you're indifference between 2 and 3, you're consistent. But then you can then see that the lower one and the top one is then the condition of invariance. And so if you're indifferent between those, then you can see that it's cyclic, so you can go any which way. So consistency and invariance would imply in stationarity, which would imply exponential discounting. Okay. Now, is there a way to motivate consistency and invariance? Now, since this is logical, this is not going to be normatively stronger than stationarity ever was in the first place. But on the other hand, it could sort of highlight aspects that may have more normative purchase that make you then think that stationarity has some sort of normative glow to it. And what I realized was I was thinking about various forms of temporal neutrality. So people talk about temporal neutrality in philosophy and have done so for a long time. So there's Spinoza saying, insofar as the mind is rational, well, it is affected equally whether the idea be of a thing future, past, or present. Ancient philosophers said this, Sidgwick, Rawls, many, many others. I won't go through all the quotes. My colleague David Brink puts it nicely where he says, temporal neutrality should be understood to claim that the temporal location of goods and harms within a life has no normative significance, except insofar as it contributes to the value of that life. We might say that on this view, temporal location has no independent significance or no significance per se. And so I was thinking about this stuff, and then I read that and I thought, temporal location in which series, the A or the B? And I thought you never see it spelled out, temporal neutrality in this kind of tensed or tenseless way. And so you could then imagine two versions of temporal neutrality. Well, you can imagine many more. Another one I'll mention later, but where you say temporal location in an A series has no significance. So where the now is shouldn't matter. And so intuitively, the thinking would be, I'm looking at all the goods distributed along my world line, and it shouldn't really matter where I am when I'm making those decisions. Tenseless temporal neutrality then is different, where it says temporal location in a B series has no significance. That's an absurd thesis on its face, because of course where things are matter to you. So if you have champagne being delivered for your birthday and it arrives a day late, you're not being irrational and saying, that sucks. And so what you have to do to beef that up is to be a kind of dictative reason, or give it some normative glow, would be to it's standard in the philosophy literature to then sort of say, I'm going to disentangle pure from impure temporal preferences. And so then they say, well, of course, for the impure stuff, it's okay. It's okay to take the impure in mind, but if it's the pure, then we're restricted to that. So that's what I just said. Yeah, so there's tenseless position making a difference. If I had flowers delivered for the birthday, it matters whether they came before or after. Anyway, long story short, I noticed that tense temporal neutrality just is or implies the consistency, right? So it's saying the temporal location in A series has no significance. So where the orange dot is doesn't matter. And then tenseless temporal neutrality is then that, the B series has no significance. So where all that stuff is, if I just slide it all along the timeline, that then doesn't matter. And again, for the pure. And so then you can have this kind of new master argument where you have temporal neutrality expressed in two different forms. One then implies consistency, one implies invariance. They two jointly imply stationarity, which then implies exponential discounting. So I think that's a better argument than I've seen to try to give exponential discounting some kind of normative glow. And then there are objections, and I'll just briefly mention them, but I can talk more about them. How much time? 4 minutes? Yeah, so, well, this one, so it's well, if nothing else too, this sort of way of thinking about things sort of nicely parses things for discussing the pros and cons of these different positions. And so here you can see, if you have, this kind of problem, Richard Pettigrew has a book on, the problem of changing selves. So if sort of this is the tensed one. So if you change, as what would be rational? It might be rational for you to switch from, maybe you preferred S and now you prefer, and now it's L. If you change, I used to like vanilla ice cream and now I like chocolate ice cream. That then might, is that irrational for me to switch? So if the orange dot is changing, then it might be rational to to violate this condition. And so then the kind of challenge is, can you answer the problem of changing cells while still implying an exponential discount function? I don't think you really can. So if you look at like Pettigrew's solution, it will not imply an exponential discount function. And then the other problem for the other one is this untangling the pure from impure. I think this is, in philosophy that people so push aside just how hard this really is. I think it's actually impossible to disentangle the two. I think it's empirically it's impossible. So that which I think has a result that the social scientists condemning people for their poor life choice, their poor life outcomes due to their temporal preferences. They're assuming always that those preferences are pure. It's a huge mistake, I think. And we can often then see that, you can often then see that if you can't disentangle the pure from impure, there's all these impurities that matter. And so if you, so you can just think in terms of, if you don't know where you're going to sleep that night, if you don't know where you're going to get your next meal, if you're going to die, we're all going to die. I mean, the model's assuming we're like infinite and you don't know you're going to age or anything. And then you can actually prove that hyperbolic discounting maximizes utility. And so unless you can disentangle the pure from the impure, you can't go around judging which is what is the normatively correct time preference function for people to have. And so that I also think in a paper you can see stuff where I try to argue that theoretically it's impossible to separate the pure from the impure. But for sure, in terms of the experiments in social science, I mean, it's hard enough to control for variables like gender, class, income, schooling, and all that stuff. Now you're trying to control for everything non-temporal, which seems very difficult. And also you can just think, well, delays always have a character, and the character could be unpleasant. Maybe I just don't want to, waiting sucks, unless it's a bad thing, then waiting is good. So anyway, the end is just that some lessons is that the exponential versus hyperbolic discounting debate is to some extent a debate over discounting potence. Discounting potence allows the inconsistencies we find in the empirical studies. The folk discount potence, but economics says we shouldn't. All these are gross oversimplifications of large number of groups of people. But there's a delicate arrangement of assumptions needed by economics, and those don't hold. Exponential discounting is not normative. And so the kind of picture I have is that when I can be fairly confident that I'm not changing, and when I don't think the world is going to change that much, then it does make sense to exponentially discount. And so when I set my alarm clock the night before for some planning for what will happen the next day, then it's probably pretty good to be an exponential discounter. When I wait that next morning, I'm still going to be kind of me-ish and still want to have a job and get to that job and show up for the teaching assignment and such. And I'm probably not going to, and the world hopefully doesn't change that much through the night, and then makes it rational for me to be an exponential discounter if I discount. That's the final word, is that there's another condition I can put up. So a lot of philosophers, when I talk about this stuff, they just say, don't discount. And so then I have another condition I could put up, which would then imply that the discount rate is 0. But that I don't discuss that here, because in this social science literature, in economics, they think they have all these other arguments where that you have to discount. And so that's not really like on the table in this dispute. It's on the table in philosophy and life, but it's not on the table in this dispute. Okay, thank you.
Thanks. I just wanted to ask if you had some thoughts about, get more precise about normativity of this discounting, because as you said, exponential discounting needs a parameter, right? And it would seem to me that maybe if you're too steep, that's obviously rational, but by itself, the theory doesn't really say. And so what could make it true that this range of that range of discounting is rational? I'm thinking that kind of like maybe in the risk literature, right? So people think, look, just as you have your credences and your utilities, you also have risk function. That's going to determine. So I don't know if you think that maybe here you also have a parameter which tells you how much you care about your future self or something, or else what other approaches one could have to try to narrow down the range of admissible exponential discountings.
Yeah, so there's at least two things there. And so one is, since I think you can't ever actually you can't actually ever disentangle the pure from the impure. I think you always need to be thinking about what the proxy, why you're discounting and what the proxy is. And so one, for instance, might be risk. And so, and then in fact, you can do like the Laura Bushok's, where she pulls out a risk function, which is very much just like this, except it's a R instead of a T. Well, the form of the function is different. And then you might be thinking, well, all of that is, if you think that discounting is rational, if you think that is discounting for risk is rational, which I think most people think it is, if that ends up covering the temporal discounting, then what's really going on is all that temporal discounting is this risk discounting. Now, on the first issue, though, about steep, I think that's also an issue which is, it's in the background, and I think I think there's a long story to tell actually about that, but there's the function. So this fight is a fight about two functions, hyperbolic versus exponential. All those parameters that make it steep or not steep, doesn't matter. Suppose I do a discount function where I discount exponentially 5% per day. Now imagine another one that's hyperbolic where I discount 5% per day, except on next Thursday I discount by 4.999999. Now I'm irrational. So they don't care about the form of the thing, and so I can approximate. So for any actual person's life, I could approximate an exponential one with a hyperbolic one. And then this like Dutch book stuff comes in too, because it might be rational for me to think that there's not that I'm not going to engage in any bets next Thursday with somebody who notices that 0.00001 deviation from that. But anyway, so what's a little weird in this literature is the neoclassical economists and philosophers condemned steep discounting. Then you had the move into, when the modern period in economics, where people became Humean about preferences and just said, you can have whatever preference you want, and so we can't condemn steepness anymore. But what they're trying to do is condemn steepness, because you see some of the same language when they were condemning steepness used against hyperbolic discounters. But really, since I can mimic the form, they're not allowed to say that really anymore, because they're just looking for inconsistencies, and they can't really condemn steepness. So it's there's something funny going on in that literature this way.
Okay, great. Thanks, Craig. I wanted to ask about the objections at the end, and just to maybe get you to say a little bit more, because I think that it's a loaded question in that we do empirical stuff trying to figure out what utility people assign to memories of pleasure and pain, how that interacts with temporal preferences and things like that. And so I think, and also looking at kind of the utility of just waiting, so tying in with two of the objections. But I was wondering the extent to which these are objections, or someone might say, oh, these are just things that we need to be able to try and factor in and control for. So the fact that it seems incredibly difficult to untangle the impure from the pure means that we need to have some way to see how much people are happy having some pain in their past because they want to be able to learn and grow from it. How much people are going to dislike some waiting no matter what because, hey, who likes waiting for good things? I mean, maybe in some cases they do. Yeah. But I was wondering whether you see these as just being things which are objections, which might make going for these kind of functions kind of, if not worthless, something approaching that or fool's errand, or whether you think their objections are more, look, these are objections of doing it oversimplistically. You can still do it, but look, this is what it's going to have to look like if and when you go down that path.
Yeah, I mean, you're right so you could defend, the parts I'm attacking, and so then maybe the criticism is maybe my criticism ends up just being kind of weakened in the sense that, where you said, Craig, are you just telling them that they need to try harder? That in itself is something because they don't try that hard. Right, so if you look at actually, so there's like real policy stuff going on, and all of this stuff is widely used in basically in most countries in public policy. So you look at something like the work on obesity, and they will attribute to, well, not they, but some particular studies will attribute to the obese time preferences such that it's sort of due to their time preference that they are then obese. That then shapes the kind of recommended policy because they're sort of to blame. On the other hand, you'll find, so they'll say, oh, all those obese are hyperbolic discounters. Well, it'll also turn out that, that's heavily associated with poverty, and poverty is heavily associated with particular food availability of particular types of healthy food. So they could have tried that, but they don't. And so what I'm trying to do is, so this enshrining of this as the normative standard kind of sets the default causal arrow the wrong way often. So if you don't think that, so this idea of sort of blaming individuals for their time preference, they're blaming their time preferences for social outcomes, when really if you have a particular life with a lot of risk and hazard and that, then hyperbolic discounting is the rational thing to do, and it's not the other way around.
I'm wondering how much this has to do with time and tense versus indexicality. So can you transfer basically everything you've said over to space?
Yeah, so we philosophers of time, we have two skills. One is we can recognize the difference between A versus B. The other one is we can take all things with T and put in X or vice versa, and then see what happens. And so actually that, the kind of positive picture I have is actually, I think that it's very much like, so there's not a big literature on spatial discounting, or to the extent there is a lot of stuff on spatial discounting, there's none of this disentangling between pure and impure. It's like, how far, this house costs this much, it's that far from this scenic hike. And, it's all sort of impure. And then of course it's context dependent, and we don't separate out a spatial discounting function and thinking it's like kind of stable personality trait or something. We don't say, Sam, his spatial discounting function is such that he really only cares about people out that are like a quarter mile away. Craig's nicer, he cares about people up to a half mile, and then it's like a steep drop off. I mean, that's just not the way it works, right? And so I think that picture is very much true also of time. But there are all these sort of artificial decisions being made to yank out this time function and then treat it as this kind of stable personality trait. Now, how much does it have to do with tense, though? And so then when I go, this is where I'm a little confused. So I just don't know enough decision theory. I think I'm in over my, I know I'm in over my head because I do think of, you know, if I'm trying to maximize utility, and I try now to conditionalize on indexicals, then well, I'm a little confused at how that's treated. Everywhere you look in the philosophy literature, then you end up with the the ILGA, you know, you wake up, what is that problem? Yeah, Sleeping Beauty problem. That's not really like, that stuff comes up there, but it's, I'm having trouble translating all that back into this. So I feel like there's something deeper going on here with conditionalizing on indexicals. And then I don't notice, I think that there won't be a big difference then ultimately between, so there will be a big difference between sort of tense versus tenseless, in both spatial tense and or indexicals and temporal. I'm not expecting there to be a big difference between the time and the space case.
Thanks for that. I quite like this graph. Well, series of graphs. First two, I think that's makes a whole lot of sense. You see the preferences over time. Has an individual would look at their trade-offs between earlier and later. In the bottom, though, we have a not just preferences over time, we have the evolution of preferences over time. And you quite, I referred to it as tau, tau and tau prime, I think. Is that an introduction of a second time dimension in this? It seems to me that way of looking at an evolution of preferences over time, if it was a complete description, we might see where the hurdle rates of change of preferences would take place. So, does this require a second time dimension the dimension of tau?
No. Well, no more than, you know, if you were worrying about the kind of smart problem and, you know, how fast the time flow type of thing. But, you know, so you're not imagining that yellow dot in this condition is moving across, but, you know, what the condition is saying is that the now there, you know, your preferences should be indifferent between that snapshot and the other snapshot. So it's not that snapshot versus a video.